floods happen, they're a natural occurrence. So rivers are able to accommodate those changes. It's nothing new. It might be new to us, but certainly not new to rivers. And so when we get in there and decide to go fix what's happened naturally by, for instance, let's focus on taking out gravel and trying to dig our way out of a flood. By digging the channel deeper, if you've got a channel that's shaped, like so, and then you dig deeper, well, you've increased the velocity because you've narrowed that area. So the water naturally is going to go faster. And by doing that, it starts to dig deeper down into the channel. And it digs deep into the side banks of the channel as well. And by doing that, naturally those materials in the banks of a river, they're usually, after a certain depth, not stone anymore. They're soil. And that obviously can't hold up against a faster velocity. So then you start to see banks falling in because you've gotten down into that soil substrate. Banks start falling in. Houses can start falling in, to be melodramatic, but it has happened.
Right.
And the river starts to widen because it's lost that natural resistance. So as the river widens, more of the material comes into the river. And then you get this situation where you have a stream that's wider and shallower. And people think it's wider and shallower, it's terrible for fish habitat. We got to get back in there and dig it out, which only sets us back. What happens next is as the river's slower, so now this is over time, the water slows down again, and it starts to deposit those larger materials as the river slows down. So over time, you've got, like gravel bars, for instance. People say, we got to get in there and take those gravel bars out. Well, those gravel bars are building up over time as the river tries to go back to what we refer to as a stable equilibrium condition, so stable geometries. So if you go back in while that process is happening, you start that whole process all over again. And I call it the adolescent stage. It's not pretty, it doesn't look good, it's not good habitat, it's shallow, it's warm, there's no large woody debris in there for fish. It doesn't look good, but you've got to let it go through that stage so that those gravel bars then become the river's new floodplain area. And the floodplain area is critical because that helps to disperse that energy that I talked about initially that makes the water go so much faster. If the water can come out of its banks into the floodplain area, that slows the water down enough so that you don't have the scour. And then when the floodwaters go down, it goes back into the stream. And a stream, even though it moves over time, can stay in stable conditions like that as long as it has access to its floodplain for perpetuity. Fish and aquatic macroinvertebrates, the stoneflies and caddisflies, need certain substrates. So they need certain size material to live in.
Right.
We all know trout like cobbly bottoms to lay their eggs on and so on. And they need a variety of habitats. So they need large woody debris, large trees, big rocks, and a variety of substrates. When we go in and take out gravel or dredge a river, we remove all of that material. And their habitat becomes, to them, a moonscape. So they don't have that variety of habitat that they need. The vegetation, because the stream has widened, has fallen into the streams and gotten taken out because it's in the way. And that's an important source of food and shading to keep the waters cool. And also to keep the banks in place to provide some resistance to high flows. So the biota goes from having a rich and varied habitat with all different kinds of sizes and materials to having a single source. So going from the rich green mountains of Vermont to a moonscape, essentially, for them, in the worst cases. And when you've got a small reach that's been affected by a flood, it's going to bounce back. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife has studied this for a long time, and they've seen after major floods, there's a huge hit in populations, and within the next year, 2 years, 3 years, it bounces right back. Well, if you go in there and take out all the habitat that is left, it takes a lot longer, and now they're predicting up to a decade on some of these streams.
Now, some of it seemed necessary at the time, didn't it?
there's a real question and a real debate about where were those imminent threats and what is an imminent threat. And part of that stems from our collective knowledge about how rivers are going to respond and how we think they're going to respond. So a lot of this, we believe, went far beyond what was necessary to protect imminent harm, protect people and property from imminent harm. It's easy to say that in retrospect, but there's no doubt that we went way above and beyond what was necessary.
And the imminent harm being people are cut off.
People are cut off, bridges are out, culverts are out, their property, their well, right, their wastewater system, their house are going to fall into the river. Those are clearly imminent threats. There were some instances where months after Tropical Storm Irene, people were still suggesting there was imminent threat when access had been restored and so on.
Okay, in those first days, the governor said dig, 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 but other people in the administration, Secretary Markowitz, after a couple of days, stepped in and said, wait a minute, everybody has to wait for a permit. Is that correct?
Well, it was more than a couple of days, because there was the immediate threat, and then there was a reaction. I believe it was almost a month later that the agency issued a statement that said, okay, it was at least a month later, it said, you do now need to get a permit, because they were giving verbal authorizations for a while.
Right.
And clearly people were going forward without even a verbal authorization. And given a choice between the two, at least a conversation with the agency about what was happening is better than nothing. And in retrospect, we now know that even those verbal conversations were kind of a nightmare. The contractor interpreted one thing, the agency thought it was saying one thing, they just...
Because nothing was written, and
right,
okay.
Right. And so we are learning from that. And
right.
There's legislation that we're working on. I'll be testifying on this afternoon about how do we take what we learn in that regard in terms of permitting and apply it statewide for the next emergency.